Hi, this is Dr. Joel B. Goodin. Welcome. Today we're talking about Chapter 1 again. Now we're to the section on theoretical or conceptual framework. Typically, these really have no differences in terms. You will choose one of the terms over the other. In other words, theoretical or conceptual. There are going to be different perspectives on what to do here. So do what your chair says, but typically if it's a quantitative study, you're going to use the word theoretical framework. And if it is a qualitative or mixed method study, you are more inclined to use a conceptual framework. I'm sure there will be lots of disagreement on that, so just do what your chair says. That happens to be the guide I go by in terms of those things. So here we're talking about the theoretical and conceptual framework. And a lot of what we're doing, especially if you're doing like a PhD, is not just research, but extending theory, existing theory on something having to do with your topic, and trying it with a new population that the theory hasn't been sort of tested with a new population, or it hasn't been tested in terms of pandemic response or in some new way. You're in a PhD, one of the sort of the big emphases is that you are extending the theory beyond what it was previously. You're adding knowledge to the theory. You're sort of informing the theory to become a broader and deeper theory or framework. So here you're asked to identify the guiding framework. And so I suggest just wording like the guiding framework for the proposed study is, and a common one I use is I think there's a so the guiding framework, and the example I used is SDT. I don't know if that hyphen actually belongs there, I forget. So the guiding framework, you want to again signal that this is what I'm sharing. You don't want to typically use more than one framework. Some do, some try to use two, and that's acceptable. But for a dissertation, typically simpler is better. Being more focused allows you to not only get to the finish line quicker, but it allows you to have a more focused and clear study. So choosing one framework is often best. You can always pull ideas and thoughts from other theories, but having one framework is good. And basically what we're doing, you're asked to identify a framework that will be used to guide your study. Essentially, this is using a single theory, model, framework, or theoretical, even just a concept or construct that will be used as the, quote, lens, think magnifying glass, by which you will understand your study, and ultimately you're going to understand the data that you collect and the findings. It's going to help you understand your findings. Imagine a teacher choosing how she wants to grade students on a particular assignment, right? She might identify options for grading that would result in a different grade outcomes for students. For instance, maybe she's looking at the number of correct answers, which results in a typical percentage grade. But if she grades on effort, many students may not, quote, get the answers correct or right, but the grade could still be high based on effort. Um, the lens that the teacher is using to evaluate the data, in this case the test, will lead to her paying attention to different aspects of the work, seeing it in different ways, and resulting in different emphases and different grades in this case. In the same way, your choice of framework will determine how you will evaluate the written or spoken, let's say like an interview, responses, which would be qualitative, and or numerical, like a survey responses. And so think about that. Not only are you choosing a framework that you think will work well to explain the phenomena or variables that are going on in your study, but you're going to actually build it into your study so that you're going to take the words from your framework and put them into your research questions. So it needs to align well with the purpose. The framework needs to make sense. If you're talking about something having to do with, let's say, culturally relevant pedagogy, then it might be strange to do, I don't know, I'm not thinking of a theory, but biopsychosocial theory or model. Your theory or framework needs to make sense with the information that you're dealing with. I can think of how I almost said, well, self-determination theory or social cognitive theory or self-efficacy as a construct might not be appropriate there, but you can make a case for things working. Motivation is a common thing, and so with culturally relevant pedagogy, for instance, you might realize, well, these theories don't have to do with culture so much, but they have to do with motivation to implement anything, to do something. And so perhaps what you're studying in terms of culturally relevant pedagogy is you want to understand why they're doing it or not doing it, or why they're doing it in parts. And so motivation would obviously be a potential lens by which to understand why it's being implemented. And so understanding, having a good theory to work with, and working with your chair to make sure that it matches well. Sometimes you want to use your topic and sort of understand what your topic is dealing with. If it's COVID-19, that's a pandemic that's dealing with a lot of uncertainty and disruption. And so you might search for theories that have to do with uncertainty and disruption or resilience or stress relief or anxiety or inequity. There's so many things. It's just a matter of how you want to understand the interviews. So choosing the framework is really a decision in the questions you're going to be asking and the way that you ask them. It is choosing not how you're going to, it's not just on the tail end saying, here's how I'll understand the data that I collect, but it's also saying on the front end how I'm going to collect the data with deliberation and conscientiousness to make sure that I'm collecting data that I can understand later. And so you're actually going to weave these words from, let's say, self-determination theory, autonomy, competence, and relatedness. You might have 3 different research questions, one dealing with each of those terms. So Identify the guiding framework, present the key concepts, briefly explain how they are related, and present the propositions relevant to the study. So, um, here it should contain the name of the framework. You might say something like, the framework that will guide the proposed study is self-determination theory. One sentence should do the trick here, but then you're going to follow up, because that's not all of it. You have to present the key concepts. Here you need to identify the most important concepts that are emphasized by the theory. I just mentioned 3 main concepts or constructs that are in the self-determination theory. But what are the building blocks of the framework that you're using? That often means they are the variables or the factors or constructs of the study that you're planning to use. So I just mentioned self-determination theory. Social cognitive theory and the construct of self-efficacy has 4 main concepts: mastery experiences, vicarious experiences, social persuasion, and physiological interpretation of or evaluation. And so you want to sort of show your expertise very briefly in chapter 1. It is going to be very brief, maybe 1 to 2 paragraphs. And in the case of self-efficacy, first define that key term, self-efficacy. So you want to define that term, first of all. It's a person's perceived ability to achieve success in a specific future task. Then proceed to discuss what is meant by the other 4 terms. Well, for example, mastery experiences involve experiences you have had succeeding in the task in question. If you've done it successfully before, you're likely to have higher self-efficacy. And so you're explaining, here are the concepts, and here's what it means if you've had this. The higher it increases, the more self-efficacy increases. And for each theory, there's sort of a dynamic that you need to explain. Here's how the theory suggests that these variables or factors or constructs work, and do they work together or do they work separately? What is the idea that the theory is presenting? So then proceed to explain the other concepts. Present all the major concepts with discussion of what the term means. Here, 1 to 3 paragraphs I think should be good. And then you're asked to briefly explain how these concepts are related and present the propositions related to the study. So how they're related, here you're going to explain how the primary framework concepts are related to one another. How are the concepts of the framework interrelated? With regard to the like self-efficacy, the 4 concepts, mastery, vicarious experiences, social encouragement, and physiological interpretation, they have a general summative effect that results in an unofficial, quote, like measure or an amount of how self-efficacious someone is or is likely to be. You might explain that mastery experiences had the most influence on increasing self-efficacy, while physiological interpretation might play a smaller or a less consistent role in influencing one's amount of self-efficacy. It's just what you're wanting to do is present a concise discussion of the main tenets, the main principles of the theory, and how the constructs are thought to work together. And on that last, the propositions relevant to your study, you want to think, what are the primary assumptions, facts, beliefs, or truisms asserted by the framework? Your writing should include the key beliefs or statements asserted by your framework. Think of it this way: if you had 3 to 5 key things about what your framework suggests, what would those 3 to 5 things be? If it's 10, 15, 20, you're probably not focusing on the main concepts. You're adding in a lot of sort of maybe the details. So you want to focus in on, it should be anywhere from 2 to 8, I would guess, main ideas, and typically 3 to 5 or 6. These will often involve or directly note the concepts you've just discussed. So this can be 1 to 2 pages in addition, just sort of. But here you're going to actually shorten it. You're going to present this pretty concisely because it's just the chapter 1. Chapter 1 is sort of an introduction to everything else that's going to come later in the paper. It's a foreshadowing, if you will, of the rest of the paper. And so here, there's actually a very long section in chapter 2 on the framework. So you're not getting into that now. So here you're asked 3 different questions. I'm going to paste them in. Explain how the framework guided the research decisions, including the development of the problem statement, the purpose statement, and the research questions. Here's what we're essentially asking. How does the framework align with influence, the problem statement? How does the framework align with the purpose statement? And how does the framework align with the research questions? I like to be super obvious about asking my students to answer this. And so I have some sentences I always give them. Alignment with the problem. Okay. Insert the name of your framework here. So if it's self-determination theory, the self-determination was appropriate. And it's good. You can use these formulaic sentences just to get it down on paper. I suggest actually sort of breaking this up into 2 sentences. But getting it down, getting the pieces in place, and then sort of massaging the wording, sort of making it so that it doesn't sound just like a robot repeating the same phrasing or phraseology over and over. So the self-determination theory was appropriate for developing the problem of implementation, lack of implementation of culturally relevant pedagogy. Okay, well that's great. Okay, I understand, but why? I want your logic. I don't want you to just tell me, oh, it's appropriate, it's strategic, it works, it aligns. Tell me why. Provide your logic. And this is not asking for a citation. This is asking for you to provide a rational justification. So it is strategic, this framework, self-determination theory, helps to deal with helps us understand the problem of implementing culturally relevant pedagogy, because it could be a matter of motivation, and self-determination theory explains that people are motivated by issues like autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So you're going to do the same thing, and again, you can break these up into 2 sentences each time, and then you can go back and change. You probably don't want to say appropriate every time. You might want to say it aligns with developing the purpose. It is strategic. It is it supports the development of the purpose. Just use some synonyms there to really get the same point across, instead of just saying appropriate over and over again. So how is it? And then you're going to say, and I encourage you to put in what your problem is. To always keep restating the problem so that people know people aren't going to memorize the problem of your study. So reminding them, the self-determination theory. You don't just say the framework is good for the problem. Instead say the self-determination theory was appropriate for developing the problem of lack of implementation of culturally relevant pedagogy. Remind them constantly what you're talking about in terms of the framework, in terms of the problem. They're not going to memorize these things, and so it's always good to restate them. It is strategic because, and that's where you put your logic. So do the same thing with the alignment with the purpose, the name of your framework. Again, I'm going to use the example of self-determination theory was appropriate for developing the purpose, which states to understand or to understand the autonomy, relatedness, and competence, or the motivational factors, we could say, to understand the motivational factors of secondary education school teachers throughout the United States. Okay, why was it appropriate then? So, it supports the implementation of the purpose by providing three sort of facets or ways by which to understand one's motivation. If they're not feeling autonomy, and you could even go in, you don't want to give too much detail here. 6 sentences total, 2 per alignment is enough. You could add another sentence and say, an autonomous individual or a person that is not feeling autonomy with their work or with culturally relevant pedagogy or curriculum may not implement it. But you don't want to do too much explaining here. That is really saved for Chapter 2. There's a section of 5 to 10, 12 pages on the framework and on really digging in and explaining everything about the theory. Again, here we have the name of the framework was appropriate for the research questions, and I haven't written the research questions, so it's kind of awkward. So sometimes you're doing two different sections at once. You might need to skip ahead or even come back and say, okay, I haven't read them yet. I need to go forward and write them and then come back to this. Okay, which ask, and just highlight it in yellow as sort of an idea that, or a signal to yourself, hey, I need to come back to this. Write a comment out to the side. This is something a lot of people don't take advantage of. Just write, come back to this. Just write notes to yourself, or even to your professor. Dr. Who, let's say that's your professor's name. I will come back to this. After I've shored up my RQs with your approval. Put a smiley face, because that makes everything better. And so just doing this, when the professor doesn't see that you've sort of talked about something, they're going to be like, well, why did you skip that one? And you've just told them. So predicting the questions that other people are going to have, especially your chair, your subject matter expert, your second, your academic reviewer, your university reviewer, whatever it is they call them at your school, predicting their questions and the issues, and then telling them ahead of time, I'm going to come back to this. I haven't skipped it. I'm not ignoring it. Because one of the things that's sort of most disheartening for me as a chair or subject matter expert or second URR, AR, is to see somebody without detail orientation. It's one of the most important things to have if you're going to be a doctoral student, especially in a dissertation, because you've got to mind the details in order to be successful. And when you start skipping stuff haphazardly, and then you make me sort of point out all the things you're skipping, then that's not cool. It doesn't make me happy. You want to show your professor, hey, I'm doing my best. I don't have this yet. And another thing I'll mention, just in terms of just communicating with your professor, say, I often suggest 3 comments. I'll put them in the same comment. fixed or done, you might write in a comment, or in a different comment, you might write alternatively, I think this is done, or a third option is I don't know how to fix this or do it. Help? Right? These are really three really good comments that you can write that, and I see this column as where you're having this asynchronous conversation with your professor so that they can understand what you're thinking as you are writing, where you need the most help. I like for my students to be self-regulated and self-directed as much as possible. You tell me it's fixed or done, I'm going to look at it, be like, you know what, you're right. Or I might say something like, not really, I think you're misunderstanding X, you know, and here's what you need to be thinking. And I'll explain that maybe. But this typically is when you're really sure that you've got it correct. And it's okay if you're wrong, but I get to sort of glance at it and say, you know what, you're right, good job. And you're going to get better at sort of identifying if you're fixed, close to fixed, I think it's fixed or done. That means you have some uncertainty, or saying, you know, I just really don't know how to do this, and that's okay. That's really good. I appreciate that. Instead of you just writing gobbledygook, I'm not sure that's a word, but instead of writing sort of silliness, you are just telling me, hey, I looked this up, I Googled it, Google Scholar, where, you know, I looked in methodological books, whatever. Obviously search for the answer, but if you don't have it, that's when you write, I don't know how to do this. Can I have some help? And normally I'll write, here's what to do, or I might write something like, let's discuss in our next meeting. I told you I like to have self-regulated students, and that's why I create these videos, so that you can do a whole lot on your own instead of always waiting till the next synchronous meeting or trying to have the conversation via email. I want you to have these videos so that you can actually move ahead without having to wait for a meeting time with me, which is sometimes hard to schedule, or, you know, with any chair, really. But what I'm able to do here is, after I see where I can double check the things that you're pretty certain about, just double check it. The things that you're saying you're less certain about, I like that honesty, and I'll say, okay, you think you have it, but you're not sure. Let me look a little closer at that one. And then you don't know how. That means you need help. You're stuck, and I don't want my students to be stuck for very long. And so I can provide even a brief little video response sometimes, and paste the link in here or whatever, and explain what you're supposed to do, or I can write it, or I can send you a link to another resource that I have. Here's an explanation, or here's an example from another student that did this successfully. So this is a good way to communicate. Getting a little bit off base there, but so communicating with your professor is something I sort of added in there. If more than one framework is guiding the study, integrate the frameworks rather than describing them independently. Do not select a separate framework for each variable or construct under examination. That will just make your study way too complex. So, if more than one framework, using more than one can greatly increase the complexity of your study. If you include multiple frameworks, you must evaluate or analyze all your data through both of the framework lenses rather than just one, or all three or four, or however many you choose. People think they're doing something smart by including all the frameworks that might be relevant. But in actuality, focusing on one is what we do. A lot of researchers, especially new novice researchers, think I need to attack everything at once. I need to understand all the confounding variables. I need to control for all the variables. I need to understand everything about this. I need to include all the frameworks that might be relevant. And really that's sort of, in my opinion, not a wise way to think about a dissertation. Think about research as a large group of academics who are all working together to chip away at all the questions in the universe, let's say, in the academic universe. So we're chipping away. We're not going to understand it based through the lens of all 5 frameworks. For now, you're gonna choose one framework and use that one. Instead of understanding all the problems that affect culturally relevant pedagogy, you're gonna focus first on the motivation. You might, in your interviews on why people are motivated, you might realize they're not motivated because they're not getting support from their principals and superintendents and stuff like that, or like in terms of professional development and education on how to actually implement culturally relevant pedagogy. And then we have an issue of, we studied motivation, but we're understanding that it's a lack of support. And so our next study is going to be sort of have to do with resources, support, and sort of understanding that. And we may use a different framework to understand that issue. So the point is, don't try to cook everything at once. Focus, be focused, and that will present a much clearer argument. And by argument, I don't mean we're arguing. I mean you're presenting a logical argument, a statement that explains yourself and what you're trying to do. The journey ahead of you is long, dark, and full of rough terrain, is what I tell some students. As some wise person once said, KISS, K-I-S-S, keep it simple, stupid. That's probably, I don't know, I'm not calling you stupid, but if you don't keep it simple, it could be said that you're not being as smart as you could be, or wise. So the idea is just avoid stupidity, keep it simple. Formulate a dissertation plan and a path for yourself that eliminates unnecessary difficulty when possible and appropriate. Do not exceed 2 pages. Sometimes you'll write a little more and then have to trim it down. Writing a little less, as long as you're on point and you're getting all the appropriate things into the paper. I say with the DPDM, the template that is used at North Central University, I always tell my students, do what the DPDM says, nothing more and nothing less. And sometimes that takes some interpretation, sometimes by me, to help them understand what is too much, what is too little. But use that as a guide. Nothing more, nothing less. Don't try to throw in a whole lot of extra discussion of the framework here, because that comes in chapter 2. Don't try to throw in stuff about methodology here, because that comes in the nature of the study and later, as it says, in Chapter 3. So don't include extraneous material. These sections are built in such a way as to include certain material, and so stick to that material, the germane content. Remove the extraneous content. That will help your reader keep up with what you're trying to present, the story that you're telling. I often suggest that students add the following sentence at the end of the section to indicate to the reader, I'll be back with more information on this issue. So students might end the section by saying a more thorough discussion of the theoretical or conceptual framework will be included in Chapter 2. That's just saying, I've just presented a very brief summary of what I plan to explain further later on. And so next we're going to talk about nature of the study. I look forward to talking with you again. Thank you very much.